Paul introduced this idea of us being heirs according to the promise back in chapter 3. We looked at that a couple of weeks ago. It says this in verse 29, "And if you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to promise." Now, I heard what Joel said, and I am convinced that this is what this passage that we're going to be in today is all about, is this idea of being heirs according to the promise. But Paul kind of does this little interlude in between that verse and then where we are today in verse 21. And he expresses, as we looked at last week, his consternation. I think it was more than consternation, but that's the word I'm going to use for it today. That the Galatian churches would allow themselves to be dragged back into slavery, a slavery caused by legalism in their world. And so Paul is finally going to flesh out now, going back to that original idea, what he means in that passage that we're going to be looking at today, and what he means by this in terms of speaking directly to those who are using these legalistic practices to subvert the gospel of grace. So we're going to pick up in verse 21 as Paul does speak directly to these people. "Tell me, you who want to be under the law, are you not aware of what the law says? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by the slave woman and the other by the free woman. His son by the slave woman was born in the ordinary way, but his son by the free woman was born as the result of a promise." And you look at that and you go, oh, okay, well, that's clear. Since it is, we'll just pray and you guys can go have lunch. No, of course it's not. But Paul is saying to the teachers of the law, the ones that were trying to drag the Galatian churches back into legalism, back into the Judaistic laws, he's saying, aren't you aware of what the law says? You who want everybody to follow the law, well, this is what it says. And then he goes back to the narrative of Genesis chapter 16 and following. And what Paul shows us is how grace and promise and faith interact by using the story of Ishmael and Isaac. He says there are two ways that we can live: the ordinary way and the better way. This theme of the ordinary versus the better is the theme really of the whole book of Galatians. However, there is also this aspect that Paul is examining, and that's what he's going to be examining here, of this idea of being a child of Abraham. And he uses that specifically because this idea of being a child of Abraham was considered to be a very high privilege among the Jews. The idea of being descended from Abraham was always a part of their history, always a part of their speech, always a part of how they thought about themselves, how they described themselves. They were always going back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, their forefathers. Maybe you remember, maybe you don't, but I'm going to remind you if you don't. When Jesus was talking to the religious leaders in John chapter 8, he talks about his father and their father. Now, when Jesus is talking about that, he's of course talking about God the Father. But they answered him, "Abraham is our father. Are you greater than our father Abraham?" And essentially what they're saying is, who do you think you're talking to? We are the children of Abraham. You see, this is how the Jews carried themselves in the wider Greek world as a whole. We're privileged and blessed because we descended from the man that God said he would bless all the whole world through. And so therefore the blessing is going to come through us at some point, and we're looking forward to that. And aren't you blessed by knowing us? So obviously now, Paul is writing to the Galatian church, and the Galatian church, the vast majority of the people in the Galatian church were pagans. And so they certainly had an opinion about Jews, and I think that we sometimes overstate it in terms of our modern thinking about ancient history. But when you read the writings of the day in the area, in the region of Asia Minor particularly, They saw Jews as highly conscientious and principled people that were valuable parts of their society, that helped build the framework of their culture together. But their religion as a whole was pretty well inaccessible to most Greek pagans. As pagans, they saw the law, they saw the God of Judaism as just another system of religions as part of a larger pantheon. Just one God among many. The idea that there was only one God in the Jewish system was a curiosity, and maybe they would explore that, and maybe it would be something that they would be attracted to, especially as they became disenchanted with the pantheon of the Greeks and Romans. Until Paul comes along and tells them, hey, this one God, the one that you're kind of thinking is a curiosity, is actually the God of the universe, the creator of everything. And this one God who created everything and rules over everything loves you. And he provided a way for you to know him. And based on what he did, and not what you did, he provides a way for you to relate to him. And so he shares with them the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now they are attracted to this. They say, yes, that's what I want. They place faith in Jesus Christ as their Savior. But even then, they still thought of Christianity as a sect within Judaism. And we know that because we have letters that were sent from a guy named Pliny the Elder and Pliny the Younger. And they were governors in Asia Minor. They wrote back and forth to Rome, and some of those letters said, hey, there's this group of people that are calling themselves the Way, and they're a sect of Judaism who believes that there is a Savior named Jesus who died and was resurrected. What should we do about them? And the letters back from Rome were, well, if they're a sect of Judaism is the Jewish faith is allowed in our system, so just leave them alone and don't bother them, and maybe they'll just go away. So we see that in their system, they believed that Christianity was just a segment of Judaism. And so Paul preaches the gospel, and all these people come to faith in Jesus Christ, and then Paul leaves, right? He doesn't stay. And immediately after Paul leaves, a group of Jewish influencers came in and they said, oh no, it's not that easy. You may follow Jesus, but Jesus was a Jewish rabbi. And so you really need to act more like a Jew. You need to be a child of Abraham. You need to show yourself as being a child of Abraham, because that's where all the spiritual privilege lies. See, you aren't doing the law. And so you're showing yourself not to be a child of Abraham. And so they worked overtime to make following the law seem like the ultimate privilege of following Jesus. And they were able to be successful because there was such a thing, and there is in all of us such a thing as a conscience. People know that they're out of step with God. Even people who don't acknowledge God in rational ways in their mind, they recognize in their conscience that there is a God. Paul says this in Romans, that people's conscience battle against them all the time. For when Gentiles, who do not have the law, by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse them or even excuse them. So when Paul comes along and introduces the Galatians to God through Jesus Christ, they got a biblical vision of what human life should be like for the very first time. But when they compared that new vision of what human life should be like against their past, there was shame and guilt that came along, because they knew that they had been out of line from the path that God had intended for their life all along. And I think that's why it was so easy for them to accept the legalistic line in their life, because they knew themselves. They knew what they had done in their pasts. They knew who they had been. And so there came this internal war of guilt and shame in their life after they came to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. Maybe you have experienced that as well in your own life. You realize now who you are, and you weigh that against who you were, and you just say, I don't deserve this. What Paul brought them was good news. They were accepted by God. The work of Jesus Christ on the cross was grace, and it was permanent for them. It was all good.